Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 24th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism through time, and stories of resistance against injustice. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Julius Mendel and Rebecca Frank. Dr. Mendel was born on August 17, 1931, to a Jewish family in Germany. His father, Dr. Herbert Mendel, served in the German military during World War I and later became a doctor. Herbert ran a successful medical practice where Julius's mother, Ilse, worked as a laboratory technician. In late October 1938, Herbert was forced to close the practice and the family fled to Cuba a month later. The Mendels spent 2 years in Cuba and immigrated to the United States in 1940. Julius went on to become a psychiatrist and has also donated over 20 objects to the museum related to his family's experiences in World War I and their escape from the Nazis. Rebecca Frank is the curatorial research assistant at the museum. She received a BA in History and Jewish Studies from Cornell University in 2019 and an MA in Holocaust Studies from the University of Haifa in 2020. During her studies, she interned at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, the Jewish Museum, and the Ghetto Fighters House Museum. If you have questions specifically for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm now going to hand things over to Becky and Jules.
Thank you so much, Sydney. So a few notes before we jump right into it. For today's story, Survive, we really wanted, because Jules has donated so many objects to the museum's collection, for him to speak about his story through the objects that he donated. So we are going to have photos of the objects on the screen for you. In general, we are going to be moving chronologically with this story and with the objects that we speak about. And of note, a couple of these objects are going to be on view in our upcoming exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, which opens for member previews on June 30th. So with that, we'll start looking at the objects and talking about Jules's story. Thank you, Jules, for being here with me today. And we're actually going to jump back a little bit from before you were born, but to talk about your father's story and about his experience in the German army during World War I. So on the left, as you can see, is this photo of Herbert with his army unit. Right here where I put my mouse is Herbert. And then on the right is an Iron Cross that he received. So Jules, what did your father tell you about his service in World War I?
Well, I wish I could say he was a very brave guy, but the Iron Cross, 3rd degree that you're showing is apparently something that everybody who served in the German army received at the end of the war, pretty much like the ruptured duck at the end of World War II that everybody got when they were in World War II. So it's a nice looking thing, but it really doesn't indicate any bravery. The interesting thing about the whole thing, about his service at the age of, I guess, 1918, he was 18. The interesting thing about it is that when the Nuremberg laws were enacted in 1932, all professions, including the judges, the doctors, lawyers, were disenfranchised. And the only exception was made for Jews who served on the front lines. And my father, being 18, was also disenfranchised in 1933. He could no longer practice medicine, but he sued the Nazi regime because he had papers that showed that he had been on the front line. He went around and got certificates from a number of his commanding officers saying that he was. And so he won the suit. Probably the only suit that anybody ever won against the Nazis. And they unfortunately allowed him to practice for another, I guess it was another 4 or 5 years, because otherwise he would have left much earlier. So by 1938, the Nazis changed their mind again. And of course, as they always did, they changed the laws. And even those military who served at the front lines could no longer practice their professions. I think that's what makes it very interesting that he had been in the army.
Yeah. Did he tell any stories to you about his time in the army?
No, like all fathers, we didn't talk about those things.
Okay.
I don't think, wait till you get to have an adolescent boy, you'll see. They have other things on their mind.
Did you what does it mean to you that your father had fought in the German army in World War I?
Say that again?
What do you have any feelings about the fact that your father had fought in World War I? Reflecting on that?
No, no. If if you want to know, he never fought against the United States or England. As an 18-year-old, he was active on the little resurrections along the border of Germany. There was some communist uprising, and the army, before it was totally disbanded, had to fight the uprising on Germany's border. That's what he was involved in.
Where was your father born?
Where?
Yeah.
A place called Osche, I believe it's spelled Osche, which changed between Poland and Germany, depending on how the wind was blowing.
So moving forward from his time in the army, are these two photos of your father with his medical school fraternity. And this is him where I have my mouse in this picture.
Yes.
And this is him in this picture.
Yes.
And I think when looking at these, it's really interesting to really see how assimilated he was into German life as a Jew during this time. What do you think about this? And did he ever tell you any stories?
Becky, that's not entirely true. This is not assimilation. This is a Jewish fraternity that had to be organized in order for these Jewish students to defend themselves. They were constantly being challenged to duels, and they had to do what the non-Jewish fraternities do, engage in duels. I'd like to say that my father engaged in duels, but he didn't. I think I don't know how it worked. I've never read much about it, so I don't know how they worked it, but I think there was certain of them were assigned to be the duelists and to protect the honor of the Jews. But he certainly didn't want his face scarred.
So this was a Jewish fraternity at his medical school.
Yes, this was all Jewish now. And in fact, this particular fraternity, I think the name was KC. I looked this up many years after. It was called a Cartel Convent. That was the abbreviation for KC. And it became the American Jewish KC fraternity. These people who, when they immigrated to the United States, especially New York, would have annual get-togethers. These men were now professionals, and for the most part, they kind of had annual get-togethers in the United States, called themselves the American Jewish KC fraternity, and I don't think it's extant anymore. This was many years ago.
Do you know if he stayed in touch with anyone from his medical school fraternity?
Say that again?
Do you know if he remained in touch with anyone from his medical school fraternity?
Oh, I'm sure. Oh, yeah. When they had get-togethers years later, they would have, yeah, they would know each other. Sure. You have to understand the German university system. They didn't stay in one university. They went from every year, every 2 years, they changed again. So where the school that they matriculated at was not the school usually that they graduated from. So
Got it.
that they had a multitude of acquaintances.
Nice. Well, moving forward to more about your father during medical school, this here on the left is his diploma from when he graduated in 1926 from Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin. And then on the right is his dissertation, also from 1926, from when he graduated. Did he, do you know how he decided to go to medical school?
When he decided to go,
Or do you know why he decided or how?
why? Well, he's a Jewish boy. I mean, you know, what else does a Jewish boy do? No, seriously. By the way, the diploma, the school that he graduated from is now called Humboldt University in Berlin.
Mhm.
And the dissertation was required in Europe, in Germany, for a doctorate degree. It's no longer, it's not required in the United States. We all had to just spend 4 years in medical school in the back row with our eyes closed. And fortunately, some of us got diplomas without a dissertation.
So this is jumping ahead a little bit, but you as well are a doctor. Were you inspired by your father to become a doctor?
Well, he did tell me I can do anything I wanted, providing I went to medical school first. That's a pretty strong. That's pretty strong.
What kind of medicine did your father practice?
He was a general practitioner.
So this is your parents at their wedding in 1930. How did they meet?
My mother was a girlfriend of my father's sister, and they thought the two girls thought it would be a good match, and it was. I mean, I think so.
And your mother worked in your father's office?
Well, that's kind of a she was really a lady, and that's an exaggeration. I must say that when my father opened a practice in New York after emigration, my mother worked very hard in his office as his nurse. But that was kind of unthinkable in Germany, in Berlin, when I think it was kind of unthinkable that a wife would dirty her hands in the office. I should have corrected it when you sent out the flyer, but I didn't want to mess you up.
Where was your mother born?
I'm not sure because she was, the World War One changed. She was born in 1906, but World War One changed so many borders. She was also probably born in that area between Poland and Germany, and I don't know exactly what city.
This is a question for both of your parents, but were they religious growing up?
I'm sorry, Becky, what?
This is a question for both of your about both of your parents, but were they religious growing up?
Were they what?
Religious.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure that women were, hate to be so sexist, but I'm not sure that women in those years, especially in Germany, were really that religious. My father was religious. He observed the holidays. He didn't smoke on Shabbos, which uh, was amazing, I thought. He was he was a very heavy smoker, but on Saturday he would not light a cigarette, and he was well educated in the religion. He came from a small town. His father was the president of the congregation, and so he was very well educated in in the Jewish religion.
So this photo's from 1930. And in 1931, you were born in Berlin. And here, this is when you're already around 6, 7 years old, is your report card from the Jewish school that you attended. And on the left is, the system for ranking your grades. And then on the right is your grades from your report card. What do you remember about your childhood in Berlin?
Well, Becky, I guess you know why it's a Jewish school.
Yeah.
Because by 1935, Jews were not allowed to attend the schools anymore, and the Jewish congregations organized their own schools. I guess they did it in a hurry because within a 1 or 2 year period, they had to hire teachers and get the school building started and so forth. So that's why it's a Jewish school. I probably would not have gone to a so-called parochial school. Interestingly enough, I did meet an older schoolmate years later who told me who he was probably 4 or 5 years older, and by coincidence he had attended the same school, and he told me that when they let out his class, which was 4 or 5 years ahead of me, the non-Jewish kids waited outside to throw stones at them because they knew the Jewish kids were coming out, and they would taunt them and try to fight with them. I did not have any of that experience.
How old were you when you started going to school?
How old?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess about 5 or 6. I was 6. I think the report card only has 1 year and then a period of another year in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm asking, so you only ever went to Jewish schools because you would have been too young,
Yes,
prior. Okay.
yes.
What else do you remember about your childhood in Berlin?
In the school?
Just in general.
Well, I do remember it was a tough school. I mean, I'm sure that the teachers were Jewish and the principal was Jewish, but they had sticks, and we this was a tough thing. You didn't talk, or you got a switch on your back or something. So it was very frightening, a frightening place for a 6-year-old to go.
Yeah. Not about school, but in general, what do you remember about what your life was like when you were young in Berlin?
What do I remember about Berlin?
Yeah. Any memories or anecdotes about not related to school, but just in general?
You mean about the regime, the Nazi regime, or?
Or just about your life? What, any first memories you have when you were little?
Remember, I was a very sheltered child. I mean, fortunately, I, you know, I lived, I lived with a nursemaid for, the whole time until everything collapsed, of course. And I would have been an awful child growing up if I had grown up like that.
Mm.
I wouldn't want to know me.
So also in 1938, here's a photo of your father in his office in Berlin examining a patient. And this
Yes,
would have been the same year, if I'm correct, that he was no longer able to practice medicine, right? Also in 1938, later that year.
38. I think they again revoked his license. Yeah.
Do you remember when they revoked his license?
No, no. Well, I do remember that he had to sell. He had to sell all of he had to sell the apartment. He had to sell his practice. He had, for a pittance of what it was worth, and some. I do remember that, and then they talked about it afterwards that the whatever it was, the SS officer who was a doctor came in and said, "Yeah, I'll give you two marks for this place. That's all it's worth." In other words, they took full advantage of the need
Mhm.
to sell everything. I think my father sold his car for another proverbial dollar.
So here on the screen, on the left is a synagogue ticket for the 1938-1939 high holidays for your synagogue in Berlin. And you can see,
Yeah, Becky, guard this with your life because this is probably the last time that anybody, unless there are other admission cards like that, the synagogue, I think, was destroyed. This is this is November. This is probably October.
yeah, the
uh,
fall of 1938. So probably September and October.
September, October. So by November, the place was, the synagogue was destroyed.
Yeah.
This is very, very valuable. I shouldn't have given it to the museum.
You can see here too the little marks showing which services that your family decided to go to. So you can see, going to one day of Rosh Hashanah, to the Kol Nidre.
I never looked at it that closely. Obviously, they didn't celebrate the second day of
Yeah,
Rosh
that's the one thing they didn't go to.
Oh,
And it has your address as well. And then actually on the other side is a Hebrew passage and then translated into German as well. But you can see here that it's on the screen at the same time with this booklet, which was produced by Jewish German organization. And it was really a how-to booklet for immigration to the US. So you can see already during this time, your family was starting to think about leaving and fleeing Germany. Do you remember this time and maybe discussions of your parents of wanting to leave?
well, they no longer had an apartment. They sold the apartment to I guess, to the doctor who was taking over, the Aryan doctor who was taking over, and this is actually a very interesting booklet if anybody speaks German, because I looked at it. This booklet this booklet tells you how to behave in the United States. And one of the things that you're supposed to do in the United States is not speak a foreign language in a loud voice, because people in the United States don't really like it when people when they overhear you talking in a foreign language. You're supposed to Americanize yourself as quickly as possible.
Huh.
Maybe we
What,
should maybe should reprint. Maybe it should be reprinted at this point.
what did you want to leave Germany? When your parents told you you were leaving, what were your feelings about it? And you would have been about 7.
Yeah, I didn't know what they were talking about. I mean, really, I had no conception of what they were talking about. I must tell you about my father, since you showed his picture. In later life, he would say he wanted to thank her Hitler from the bottom of his heart for allowing him to live in this country. And I kind of always agreed with him because
Wow.
when you come from there and you realize the freedom that you have in this country, it's unbelievable.
So, circling back for just one moment to the synagogue ticket, do you have any stories or memories about your synagogue in Berlin?
I doubt that I went.
Oh.
These synagogues were not for children, because I remember, you go to the synagogue, you wear a high hat, and you dress in pretty much formal clothes. So I don't think this was a place for children.
Got it. So, moving forward, right here is an affidavit of support that your father's cousin, Jacob Hahn, had made for your father and your family from New York City, September 12th, 1938. And I think something that's really interesting about it is you could see where my mouse is, that it says that if your father was to come to the United States, that he is a physician who believes he can improve his condition in this country. His practice in Germany has been curtailed by reason of the laws of October 1st. So when did Jacob Hahn move to the United States? And had your father and him been in close touch?
Well, if I may be permitted to tell you a story,
Please.
as all lucky stories are, Jack Hahn, who is a first cousin of my father's, visited Germany in 1910 with his father to in 1910 to pay a visit to Jack Hahn's mother, if you follow it now.
Mm-hmm.
And my father, who is 10 years old, and Jack Hahn, who is 10 years old, played together. And that's the last that they had any contact. The war came in, people did other things, and when 1930s, I guess 37, 38 came around, my father needed an affidavit of support. He didn't know anybody in the United States. Neither my father nor my mother knew anybody in the United States. So my father went to the central telephone directory in Berlin and looked up Hahn in the telephone book of Manhattan. The only thing he knew about Hahn was that his name was probably Addie. Somehow my father knew that they called him Addie. Maybe it was a nickname. And he saw Hahn, Atty, in the Manhattan phone book. And he wrote to Addie Hahn in the Manhattan phone book saying, if you're the Addie Hahn who came to visit your mother with your father in 1910 and so forth, would you write an affidavit of support for me if you can remember? Well, it turned out to be Jacob Hahn was an attorney, and the phone book listed him as Atty. His name was Jack J. Jacob, not Addie. And this was one of those coincidences that happened throughout to many, many people. I've heard this over and over again, that survival rested on just a coincidence. And that was one of those coincidences. Um, and that fortunately was also Jack Hahn had only had an office in Manhattan. He lived on Long Island, and so it was just a lucky thing that he happened to find the office. So again, I'm sure you've heard this over and over again from other survivors.
Oh, it's an amazing story. And I'm curious when you, and we'll go through the whole story, but I'm curious, jumping ahead a little bit, is when you eventually did get to the United States, did you meet him, Jack?
Yes, Jack actually met us when we first arrived, and then we got quite close with his family. I'm still close with him, and when let's see, when this is Jack writing the affidavit. When Jack's son turned 75 or 80, 75, about 10 or 15 years ago, he had a big party and everybody brought a present. And I had this affidavit framed,
Wow.
and I gave a little talk and told the people gathered why I'm giving this and so forth. And I thanked him for saving my family's life. And this George, his name was, the son was George. George, who was a big guy, at this point, quite well-known lawyer, his tears started in his eyes. It's a very emotional thing. So if you ask me if we saw them afterwards, yes,
Wow.
we became quite friendly.
That's beautiful. So these here are your parents' passports from November 15th, 1938. So you could see here's your mother and your father, and they're both from the exact same date. And obviously, as we know, this is very shortly after Kristallnacht when these passports were. Do you remember Kristallnacht?
Say that again, Becky.
Do you remember Kristallnacht that night?
No, we were out of the country, I think, or out of the country by a few days. But the interesting thing about this passport is that you can't turn it over, huh?
Not the ones right here, the ones downstairs in our archive.
names, the first names, were crossed out.
Right.
And Israel and Sarah were now the first names. So I always think of this as the omen of things to come before people lost their names, and then they had numbers assigned. So, we should have known what was about to happen.
So these were issued in November of 1938. When did your family leave the country?
Must be the same week.
Wow.
We were out of there by toward the end of November 38.
So then,
but it was the Nazis were in power enough. I'm not sure whether that was issued. I'd have to look at that closely. It may be that they were stamped that you left on the 15th. Has anybody looked at these?
We have, but we can do more research into exactly what that date means.
Because it may be, that stamp may be an exit stamp.
Right.
It was.
Yeah, because then moving forward, here are both of their Cuban foreign resident identification cards. And so here's your father on the left and your mother on the right. How was it that you went to Cuba? Why was it that your family decided to go there?
Decided?
Or why is it that your family went there?
Well, because you had to go somewhere. The United States had a quota. You had to wait until your quota number is up, and you had to go somewhere. And I guess Havana at that point was taking people, and only a year later, when the St. Louis couldn't dock,
Right.
everybody was sent back. At that point, in 38, I don't see any date, but at that point,
December.
December. Yeah, so they registered December 6th.
Yep.
Yeah, I see, December 6th. So at that point, they arrived in Cuba. Cuba was the one place. There were a number of other places, I'm sure you know. There was Shanghai and South America, certain countries, but Cuba seemed like a reasonable place.
What do you remember about your journey to Cuba?
Well, you're really getting me to talk, Becky. They were not allowed to take any money at all out of Germany. Everything would be confiscated. So my parents went on a shopping spree. They bought cameras and in addition, they bought first class tickets on a rather fancy steamship, the Hamburg American line. The name of the ship was the Orinoco, which was a well-known ship at that time. And we traveled first class. I mean, I never traveled that well for the rest of my life. There was a kindergarten for children where we played on the deck and supervised by a steward in a uniform and all sorts of activities. The one thing that I do remember is that my parents told me this, is that the captain said that it was his ship and he doesn't go by the laws of the country. He was the captain of his ship, and if they had racial laws in Germany, they didn't apply. They didn't apply for his ship, and so the Jewish passengers ate in first class dining room, danced away the night, whatever they did, and they never lived as well thereafter. It's like a fairy tale.
When you got to Cuba, did you go to school there?
Did I what?
Did you go to school when you got there?
Oh yeah, I went to the first school I went to was kind of a big inner city school where we lived very briefly for a while, and I didn't speak a word of Spanish, and I had to be in a school where everybody spoke Spanish. So I guess the principal assigned a young Polish girl my age who spoke Yiddish. And by speaking Yiddish, to me, which was as close to German, I guess, at the time, I was able to understand what was going on. And kids that age learn very quickly. And I must say, within 6 months, I was trilingual. I was trilingual because after that, I went to an English school where we learned Spanish for half a day and the same courses in English for another half a day. So by the time we left Cuba, I was trilingual.
What other memories do you have about your time in Cuba?
It was good. It was a good time. I mean, I got friendly with some kids, and you know, the family would take me on, and we'd go to the beach and things like that. So my parents worked hard to make a go of it. Actually, my father worked as a doctor. He couldn't practice medicine, so because he didn't have a license. Sometimes it pays to do things sub rosa, and I don't think I would recommend it to anybody. But a very friendly Cuban doctor took a liking to my father and gave him prescriptions that he could use. Uh, and my father practiced medicine among recent emigres from Germany who wanted a German doctor.
Hmm.
And so he was able to make some kind of living. I'm sure it's not the best kind of living, but he practiced without a license. Today in New York, he'd be arrested and spend 20 years in jail.
So
But you didn't hear that from me.
you were between the ages of 7 and 9 when you were there. Did
Say
your
that?
parent You were between the ages of 7 and 9 when you were there in Cuba. Did your parents speak to you about the war? Did you know that the war was ongoing?
Well, I knew that the St. Louis was waiting out in the harbor
Mm.
and couldn't dock. I also knew that my parents, who knew a number of people on the St. Louis, went out to with these small boats that were circling the St. Louis um, to wave to them and shout to them. So I knew something was up, but I was more interested in going to the beach.
Yeah. So here is when you were eventually getting ready to leave Cuba. This is your affidavit in lieu of a passport for all three of you. For everyone, this is a very young Jules right here, and then both of his
With
parents.
gap teeth.
Yes.
Trying to figure out how the teeth came together. I don't know.
And so when it was finally time to come to New York, do you remember that?
Oh, I sure do. I lived in Cuba for 2 years in the tropics, and we arrived in New York in December, and it was snowing and cold, but it was nice.
What
It
is
was sort of the end of the road, I thought.
what's your first memory from when you got to New York?
Well, walking on Broadway, and it was cold, and the streets were big. Yeah, it was a little different than Cuba at the time.
Mm-hmm. And what was your life like, in those first few years in New York during the war?
Um, oh, we lived in a walk up. I guess I should give a shout out to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. You come to the United States penniless, not knowing anything, and Hyas had a place on 68th Street called the Congress House, where the men and women lived separately. Men and women were separated, but you got 3 meals a day, and you got a place to live. And I think you were allowed to stay about a month while you looked for a place to live, look for some employment where you could make some kind of living to pay the rent. So they gave you a foothold, And I think that's a wonderful thing. I'm not sure if this exists today, but I gotta give a shout out to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society.
Yeah,
You've heard of it?
yeah, definitely. That's great. And you can see here is your father's US alien identification card from 1942. So you had already been in the US for over a year at this point when he got this card.
Well, we were enemy aliens, even though we were German and we were kicked out. We were at that point stateless, but we were enemy aliens, and my parents had to hand in their expensive Leica, which they bought with the money that they had to buy the stuff and had to get rid of the money in Germany. So they had to give in all their optical equipment. And fortunately, we were able to live free, unlike some other people that were actually uh, put in, put in camps later on because they were considered enemy aliens.
So then here is the certificate for your father to be able to practice medicine in New York from October of 1942. Do you know, was it really difficult for him to be able to get that authorization to practice here in the United States?
Well, in those years, the first thing you had to do is pass an English. You had to show proficiency in English. So there was an English test first. Once you passed the English test, you took the state board. Some people had a lot of difficulty. Once you failed, then you had to wait another 6 months. Fortunately, my father passed the first time, so it was a relief. And as soon as he passed, why, then the place was another interesting serendipitous story. Somewhere in some newspaper, it was published that he had passed his New York State board to practice medicine. And somebody read that who knew him from Europe. I think might have been a former patient who is now employed on Long Island in a community, actually Bayside in Queens, and who wrote to him and who said that if you're the same person that I knew, we need a doctor.
Wow.
People, all the doctors in this community have been drafted. This was 1942. The doctors have drafted. We have no doctor. Would you come and look here and see if you can practice here? And Becky, the rest is history.
Yeah. Where did he open his practice?
Pardon me?
Where did your father open his medical practice?
In Bayside in Queens.
Wow. So then, as we continue on to, I'm going to ask you some questions about later in your life, and we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So I know many of you have written in with questions, and then feel free to keep on writing in. I want to ask you first, so we'll just leave this affidavit up that we've already seen when we go over some of these conclusion questions. And I want to ask, what do you remember about the end of the war?
The end of the war?
Yeah.
My God, everybody my age remembers the end of the war. You know, I can tell you exactly what I did at the day of Pearl Harbor. I can tell you what I did at the end of the war. I mean, those are memories that an old geezer like all of us remember these days.
So what did you do the day of Pearl Harbor?
It was a Sunday. I was a kid, and I was, a Sunday about noontime, and I was actually, if you don't tell anybody, I was lying in my parents' bed while they were, I think, getting ready to they were doing their Sunday morning ablutions. And suddenly everybody said, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" You know, nobody knew where Pearl Harbor was.
Can you tell us a bit about your life growing up and as an adult, and deciding to you yourself become a doctor, a psychiatrist, and moving forward throughout your life?
Becky, what would you like to know?
It, it was a question from the audience, so just a bit about the rest of your life. I know we have limited time, but if there's any anecdotes or things you would like to share.
Well, I took a while getting to know what I wanted to do. I started out as an internist, a pulmonologist, a cardiologist, and I wasn't happy with those areas. And then I found psychiatry, and I must say I was the happiest, and I was a happy camper after that. I mean, I was successful in what I did, is what I'm saying. I would not have been that successful in another specialty.
Did you keep in touch with anyone from Cuba after you left and once you got to the United States?
Go back?
No, did you keep in touch with anyone from Cuba?
Not really, no. Yeah, but there were some kids that I played with that somehow I did hear from them afterwards, but then, not after a while.
As an adult, have you been back to Berlin?
Yes. The Berlin municipal government had a program where they invited former residents of Berlin back. I at the time that I went, my mother went after my father died on a trip, and then I went, but I wasn't old enough. They invited the old people first. So I actually went with my wife, and I wasn't old enough. So what they did was they they allowed me, they paid for my hotel room, my hotel, but because I wasn't old enough for the whole shebang, I had to buy my dinners myself. So I got a half a trip. And they didn't pay for transportation.
What was it like for you being back there in Germany?
It was difficult because I ran into a lot of Germans who tried to deny what happened. In many, the thing was that I still speak fluent German, so I was able to understand what they were saying, sotto voce. In other words, behind my back, or what they tried to. So there's still this goes back now 25 years. I've been back since, and since then the whole atmosphere has been totally different. But early on, there were still people who were saying, for instance, one person said, this was all the Jews' fault with what happened. I said, what do you mean the Jews' fault? He said, he said, the rich Jews ran away. They could have taken the poor Jews, but the rich Jews just ran away. They left the poor Jews here. And then another place, tried to convince me how much the Germans suffered. When I questioned I was able to kind of play dumb and they would tell me how terrible, terrible the war was for them. So it wasn't the first. If you ask me how the first trip went, it was interesting, but had bitter parts to it.
Yeah. I think that's, a transition to one of the closing questions that I have for you is, speaking about that type of denial and about anti-Semitism experienced post-war. And in today's day and age, I'm curious what messages you have for future generations, and that people that hear your story, what you would love their takeaways to be.
Well, I think one of the things that that impressed me when I kind of thought about what you were going to show, the show and tell part, many of these things, if you think about it, foretold what was to come.
Yeah.
Much magnified. First they take away your first name, and then they take away your whole name. First they allow some Jews to practice, but not others, and then everybody's when you have a totalitarian regime, the whole thing eats you up after a while, if you know what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Be careful when you have a totalitarian regime. I guess that's my message. And maybe the Ukrainians are starting to learn this now too.
Well, Jules, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure getting to hear your story and to talk about it through the objects that you donated to the museum over many years. And are there any last things that you'd like to say before I hand it back to Sydney?
No, I thank you, Becky. It's been interesting.
Thank you. So Sydney, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jules. This has been so interesting to get to listen to you and learn all about the objects that you donated. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And Becky, thank you so much for putting all of these together and putting together these questions. I personally learned so much. So thank you to you both.
Thank you so
much.
much.
And I would like to thank.
We'll keep in touch.
Yes, for sure. And
Okay.
I also want to thank everybody. Done? We're almost done. I just want to thank everybody who is out there listening to us, and let you all know that everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. So to those of you watching, excuse me, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out on our website. Have a great afternoon. Thank you again to Jules, and thank you, Becky, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
So long.
Bye.